Now in the last video, we saw how we could read in data from a CSV file, pass through its contents, and perform some filtering criteria in order to analyze some of the data. In this video, we're going to see how we can write to CSV files, and then we're going to see how CSV files can be analyzed utilizing a module known as pandas. So firstly, to create a CSV file utilizing lists, we can first of all import the CSV module, and let's just say we wanted to create a CSV file with 3 simple headers, and we'll call these headers student_name, age, and fav_subject, which stands for favorite subject. We can then create some rows of data. So we'll first of all create a list, and inside of this list, we're going to then create a separate list for each row that we want to observe in the CSV file. So let's suppose that the first row has a student name Harry, their age is 20, and Harry's favourite subject is maths. We can then create a second list, and we'll have their name as Kim. Kim is 27, and their favourite subject is English. And finally we'll have Dave. Dave is 36, and Dave's favourite subject is biology. Now with this data, we can perform very similar syntax to the reading of CSV data with one simple change. So we can put the keyword with, we'll then call upon the open function, we will call this CSV file school.csv, and the name of the CSV file can be anything you want. The second parameter we'll pass in is that W, which stands for write, and we'll then pass in a third argument into a parameter called newLine, and we're going to set this equal to an empty string. And if I open up the documentation and scroll down, you can see here that newLine controls how universal newlines works. And it then tells us how it works as follows. I'm not going to go through this now, but you can read this in your own time. So in the interest of time, we can see this as new lines being represented on separate rows. We can then alias this as file like we did previously. I can then put a colon. We will then set a variable called writer equal to a call on a method called writer on the CSV module. So we can put csv.writer, and in parentheses we will put file. And this will create a writer class object which we can now call upon. So we can put writer and then call upon a method called writeRow, and we can then pass in headers as the argument. And what this will essentially do is create our headers that we've created in the list above. We can then call upon the writeRows method on the writer object, and then pass in rows into parentheses. And as you've probably guessed, this will simply create the rows that we've defined here underneath the respective headers. If I now go to the folder location where this school.csv file has been saved, and it's in the same location where I've saved this specific notebook, you can see that when I open up school.csv, we have a CSV file that's been created accordingly, directly from Jupyter Notebook, utilizing Python. Now to show you an example how this is done utilizing dictionaries, we'll first of all create a variable called myDict and set this equal to a list. Now inside of the list parentheses, i.e. these square brackets, we can put a dictionary representing each row of data. So we can first of all have a dictionary with the key region, which will represent the field name, and this will have an associated value of England. I can then put a second column, so we'll put the second key name as name, and this will have an associated value of fruit store. We can then have a third column called sales, and this will have an associated value of 10,000. I can then simply copy and paste this dictionary 3 more times, and I'll call the second region Scotland. The name can be electronics, and the sales can be 50,000. The third row will have a region England, the name can be card store, and the sales of the card store can be 5,000. And our fourth row of data, the region will be Ireland, the name will be sports store, and the sales will be 15,000. We can now create the names of the fields for each column. So if I set a variable called fields and set this equal to a list with the first element set to the string region, the second element set to the string name, and the third element set to the string sales, what we can now do is with open and then open parentheses, we can then pass in the name of the CSV file that we want to create. So we'll call this CSV file shop.csv. We'll then pass in a second argument labeled W for write. And our third argument will be passed into the new line parameter, which is that empty string. Once again, we'll alias this as file. We can then create a variable called writer, and we can set this equal to csv.dictWriter. So we're now utilizing the dictWriter method in order to create a dictWriter class object, which is going to create a file called shop.csv, and the field names will set equal to the variable fields that we've created above. We can then put writer and access the write header method on this object. And this will do exactly what you expect. It will write the column headers for us within the CSV file. We can then put writer.writeRows, and inside the parentheses of the writeRows method, we can put myDict, which is that first object that we created above. When I now run this code cell and then go and open up the shop.csv file that's now been saved in the same folder location as this specific notebook, you can see that we get a CSV file in the exact format that we expect. We have 3 columns labeled region, name, and sales, and the valid values under each column name are as we stipulated in the code cell. So a couple of examples there of how we can create CSV files using Python within the notebook directly. Now finally, I just want to introduce a very powerful module called pandas, which can also be used to read in CSV data. It can write to CSV files, and we can also analyze data from these specific files. So first of all, we're going to import pandas as PD, and then we're going to set a data variable to equal a call on the pandas module, so PD. We're then going to access a method called read_CSV, and inside this method's parentheses, we're simply going to pass in the CSV file that we're trying to analyze. And for this example, we're going to analyze the shop.csv file that we created in the previous cell. Now with this data now stored in a variable called data, I can now put data.head and then parentheses, and what the head method will do is simply show us by default the first 5 records from the CSV file. Now seeing as we only have 4 records in the CSV file, we get the complete data back. And you can see that it shows us this data in a much more user-friendly format. We get the column names in bold, we can see that we have an index number down the left-hand side, we have better row formatting, and it's just a lot cleaner to see. Now with this data stored in the data variable, we can now do specific analytics on top of it. For example, let's suppose we wanted to sum up all the sales across these 4 shops. If I put data, open up square brackets and then access the sales column, I can then call the sum method on this column, and you can see that when I run this cell, we get 80,000 returned. Now the pandas module is very powerful for data analytics, and I'll be covering pandas in a completely separate course that goes into its capabilities in much more detail. But hopefully this gives you a flavour as to what it can be used for. Now pandas can also be used to write data to CSV files, so if we were to create a data frame called df and set this equal to a call on the data frame method, so pd.dataframe, and inside parentheses we pass in a list for which the first element will be a list which contains James with the age 34. We'll then have a second person called Jane who's 51. We'll then set the columns names, so we can set a parameter called columns equal to a list where the first column will be labelled name and the second column will be labelled age. We can then, with this data frame, simply create a CSV file. And the way we do this is not by putting read_CSV, it's by utilizing the to_CSV in order to send this data to a CSV file. So we can put df.to_CSV. Inside parentheses, we can pass the file name people.csv. So that's now been created for us. So without even looking at what we've just saved down, let's now read that CSV file back in to Jupyter Notebook. So we can put data equals pd.read_CSV. We know we called the CSV file people.csv. And we want to select the columns that we want to observe from the CSV file. So we'll put use cols equals, and then we'll pass in name and age into a list. When we now observe the data, so if I put data.head and then parentheses, when I run this code cell, you can see we get a very small data frame, which is a very user-friendly format with the data that we set above when we sent this data to a CSV file. So lots of different examples here as to how we can read data from CSV files, how we can send data to CSV files, and how we can perform analytics on top of this data if we so desire. Now, as I've said before, pandas is a very powerful way of doing this. So if you are interested in learning about data analytics and how the pandas module can help you become a data analyst pro, then make sure you keep an eye out for my pandas course. It's going to cover so much content, so I hope to see you inside. In the next video, we're going to observe how we can read data from PDF files, something which I'm sure has been a challenge for everyone if you've tried to do it. So hopefully in the next video, I'll show you how it can be done effectively. So I'll see you in the next video.